Hi guys, this is recording number 2 for Macbeth. Recording number 1 was posted on Monday, March the 16th, and in recording number 1 we covered the historical context and background and kind of did an overview for the play that you started reading this week, Macbeth by William Shakespeare. Today we're going to briefly review a little bit of that historical context, and then we're going to talk about the characters and Act 1. So some essential questions to keep in mind as we're moving through the play are, of course, what were Shakespeare's inspirations for Macbeth? And the first recording that I posted on Monday, the 16th, talks a lot about that. We're going to keep in mind what are some of the motifs and themes that we see recurring throughout the play. What is the imagery in Macbeth, and what is a tragedy? So when we think about the meaning of Macbeth, there are all sorts of things that we could talk about. I've listed some of them here. First, it is a play of illusions, which means the effect of the mysterious or the supernatural on humans, on mankind. It's a play of ideas or themes, for example, appearance versus reality. It's a play about gender. It's a tragedy. It's the fall of a great person that's brought about by a fatal flaw in their character. It's a historical thriller. It's a fast-moving, action-packed murder mystery demonstrating that crime doesn't pay. It could be considered a psychological study of a murderer's mind. And it's also a play of political and social realism. We see how oppressive and hierarchical society can corrupt different individuals. So all of these things can be found as we're reading through the play. We could apply any of these ideas to Macbeth. So the historical context of Macbeth, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because, like I said, we already spent an entire, we did an entire focus just on the historical context. So this is just kind of a brief reminder. Remember, Shakespeare was a playwright. He was not a historian. However, he did know that history provided great material for his plays because history provides topics like war, conflict, ambition, and the downfall of great rulers. In the 11th century, so the 1000s, Scotland was a very violent and troubled country. Feuding families and clans fought to control trade and territory. The castle was the power base of each rival warlord, and the political murder and revenge killings were commonplace. So the historical setting of Scotland and kind of what was going on in history during the 11th century really provided a good skeleton for Shakespeare's play Macbeth. The real Macbeth was born in the year 1005, and he was the son of a ruling family. We're talking about the real Macbeth in history, not Shakespeare's character Macbeth. The real Macbeth's father was murdered by his cousin, and Macbeth married the granddaughter of the High King of Scotland. The real King Duncan and Macbeth, this is kind of a contrast or compare and contrast. King Duncan was the King of Scotland at the time that the real Macbeth was born. Duncan was 38 at the time of his murder, and it was a murder possibly committed by the real Macbeth. And Macbeth was elected the High King of Scotland in the year 1040. Macbeth ruled Scotland for 17 years, during which time Scotland became comparatively peaceful and stable. Duncan's son, Malcolm, invaded Scotland in 1054, supported by Edward the Confessor, and then Macbeth was killed on August 15th, 1057, and buried at Iona, the sacred burial place of the kings of Scotland. So this is the real King Duncan and the real Macbeth that actually existed in history. This was some fact about them. And then we'll see that Shakespeare kind of spun his characters off of them. So, what's the takeaway? Why do we talk about this? It's important to know that Shakespeare modeled his play after an actual historical figure. Some of the plot points are the same, but the real Macbeth was almost universally loved and respected, whereas Shakespeare's Macbeth wasn't. It's important to understand, again, that even though Shakespeare's play is based on or modeled after history, Shakespeare definitely took some creative license in changing some things and not staying factual in the events of the play. If you've started reading, you'll notice the language of Macbeth. As with all Shakespeare, we have this very heavy Shakespearean language. Almost all of Macbeth is written in blank verse, which is unrhymed, iambic pentameter. Macbeth and Lady Macbeth use blank verse. The witches, you'll notice, use rhymed iambic tetrameter. So when the witches are speaking, we kind of see a shift in the language. It becomes it's rhyming, and the rhythm is a little bit different. And as you're reading, I want you to take notice, see if you can figure this out by the time we meet together. Who uses prose in the play? The function of blank verse in Shakespearean drama is important. Blank verse originated from Latin and Greek sources, and it's widely employed as a vehicle in English dramatic poetry and prose to create a specific grandeur. Blank verse has a similarity to normal speech, but it's written in a variety of patterns which bring interruptions like pauses. Therefore, the intention is to produce a formal, rhythmical pattern that creates musical effects. So, because of that musical effect, it tends to capture the attention of the readers and listeners, which is its primary objective. So, here's a snip of that. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. This is from Macbeth. And notice that Shakespeare wrote verses in iambic pentameter pattern without rhyme. And Macbeth is a really good example of blank verse. Many of the speeches in the play are written in the form of blank verse. So now that you've started, hopefully you've started your reading, and we're at least into Act 1 a little bit, or you're going to be reading Act 1 shortly. Some of the characters that we have to keep straight, or the most important characters in the story, are Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, the three witches, Banquo, Malcolm, and Macduff. So we're going to talk about each of these characters a little bit. Macbeth is the protagonist of the play. He starts out with the title the Thane of Glamis, then he becomes the Thane of Cawdor, and then the King of Scotland. Macbeth is extremely ambitious and careful in his actions at first. The play focuses on his different mindsets as the play progresses. And Macbeth is a person that is extremely obsessed with the idea of destiny and fate. Lady Macbeth is Macbeth's wife. She is initially one of the play's antagonists. At the beginning, we see her in opposition to Macbeth. She believes that Macbeth was destined to be king, and she's usually the person behind the scenes that pushes Macbeth into performing bad deeds. Eventually, she gets caught up with the bad deeds that she and her husband have performed. She kind of goes insane and eventually ends up killing herself. The three witches, these are antagonists kind of behind the scenes. They provide Macbeth with the visions of the future. So they kind of add to his ambition. They give him these snippets of the future, and they're often the reason that provided evil thoughts to Macbeth that cloud his judgment. They work with the evil witch goddess Hecate, and they popped up in the play. They pop up from time to time, giving Macbeth these little hints or little speeches. Um, and they really are kind of the driving force behind Macbeth's decisions and reasoning. So, why does Shakespeare include witches in the play? What would Macbeth's audience, the initial audience of Macbeth, thought about these witches? Well, it's important that you know that during the Elizabethan era, we had this kind of witch mania, and most people at this time believed in witches. So there were these circulating pamphlets that contained tales of witches and witchcraft. They would be equivalent of like a newspaper today. So this was a very relevant, real topic at the time. So I think Shakespeare just includes the witches into the play just to make it kind of relevant and give it another aspect of entertainment for the initial audience during the Elizabethan era. Back to characters. Banquo. Banquo was once Macbeth's trusted friend. Banquo has a son by the name of Fleance. Banquo is soon suspected by Macbeth due to the vision that the witches gave him that his sons will be king. Banquo was ordered to be assassinated by Macbeth when he hired three other assassinations. And Banquo later haunts Macbeth in his assembly by his ghost floating around on Macbeth's spot. Macduff is one of the people that never seems to trust Macbeth throughout the play. He later grabbed the suspicion of Macbeth due to the warnings of the witches, and his family was all ordered to be killed by Macbeth. Macduff later avenged his family by dueling and killing Macbeth in a fight. So we're going to look a little bit closer at Act 1. We're going to do a little bit of a summary and then some analysis of Act 1. In the tragedy of Macbeth, Act 1, the war hero, Macbeth, returns home, and on the way home, he encounters three witches who prophesy that he will one day be the king of Scotland. Macbeth is seized by this ruthless ambition and is spurred on by his wife, so Macbeth plans to murder King Duncan so that he can become king. And this one act kind of sets up the downfall of Macbeth. When we look at the play, and especially in Act 1, we have to consider the idea of fate. So the word fate is defined as the will or principle or determining cause by which things in general are believed to come to be as they are or events to happen as they do. We often use the word fate interchangeably with destiny. It sometimes deals a straight flush, um, like like a character has no idea that they're just in the right place at the right time. It's kind of an unavoidable destiny, right? Where you're going to be is where you're going to be no matter what. So as we move throughout this play, I want you to think about the role of fate in Macbeth's life and in some of the other characters. How does the role of fate apply in this play? So Act 1 has 7 scenes. We're going to break them down a little bit, just kind of summarizing everything that happens. In Act 1, scenes 1 and 2, the play starts off with these 3 witches appearing on the field. They begin chanting that they are on the way to Macbeth. In the next scene, the current King of Scotland, King Duncan, appears talking about the invaders from Ireland due to the area's rebellion. The captain mentions his general Macbeth has slain the leader of the rebellion with his bravery. His kinsman Ross steps into the room and tells him that the noble with the title of Thane of Cawdor has betrayed him with Norway, and that the Norwegian army is defeated. King Duncan orders that the Cawdor to be killed and that Macbeth to be received for the title immediately, and sends Ross out to find Macbeth. In scene 3, the witches appear on the top of the hill with a bolt of thunder. The witches see Macbeth and Banquo walking, and they greet them. Macbeth and Banquo are horrified at looking at these witches and their question. They ask if they're human. The witches walk ahead and hail Macbeth of the future titles that he is about to achieve. They also tell Macbeth that he's going to be a king in the future. The witches then turn to Banquo and tell him that he was less but greater than Macbeth, and that he will never be king, but his children will be king. Ross and Angus come in and tell Macbeth that he has received the title Thane of Cawdor. This, of course, immediately verifies one of the witches' prophecies, so Macbeth is surprised at the accuracy of the witches' question, of the witches, and questions himself if he should actually one day be king. In Act 1, scenes 4 and 5, Malcolm enters to tell Duncan that the Thane of Cawdor has been killed. Duncan, seeing his general Macbeth and Banquo, and names Malcolm to be the next king of Scotland. Macbeth sees this as a threat to his path of being king and quickly leaves the scene to talk to his wife. Duncan arranges a feast at Macbeth's castle. Act 1, Scene 5 acts as a scene for Lady Macbeth to declare her to release all mercy and become cruel. She reads the letter and decides to help Macbeth become king. Macbeth came in later. She tells him that she'll help him kill Duncan at the party. Act 1, Scenes 6 and 7. Duncan is with his kinsmen. He arrives at Macbeth's castle, and Lady Macbeth greets them. Duncan is later taken into the castle by Macbeth after showing her hospitality. In the next scene, Macbeth questions himself whether he really wants to kill Duncan or not. He concludes that he, in fact, should not kill Duncan. But Lady Macbeth comes in. She calls him a coward, and she tells them that he has to do this, which makes Macbeth believe that maybe he should actually do it. They devise a plan to kill Duncan and smear his bloods on the guards. Macbeth, surprised at his wife's plan, quickly agrees to do it and carries it out. So some important aspects of scene 1, some things I want you to keep in mind. Witches. The witches' prophecies are predicted that Macbeth will become the Thane of Glamis, the Thane of Cawdor, and then he will eventually become king. They also predict that Banquo's children will take over the throne eventually, and Banquo questions the witches, questions what the witches have told them. Macbeth meets with Duncan, and Duncan announces that Malcolm will be the heir to his throne. Macbeth now realizes that Malcolm is standing between him and the prophecy. Macbeth sends a letter to Lady Macbeth. The letter tells Lady Macbeth that he is now the Thane of Cawdor and explains his meeting with the witches. Keep in mind the plans to kill Duncan. Where did this come from? Lady Macbeth and Macbeth make plans on how they will kill Duncan so that Macbeth can take the throne. However, Macbeth wants to back out. He decides he does not want to kill Duncan. But then Lady Macbeth, his wife, kind of questions his manhood. She calls him a coward. She says that it's his destiny, that he has to do this. So then Macbeth agrees that they will proceed with the murder. We start to see some changes in the characters almost right away. For Macbeth, after receiving the prophecy, He becomes willing to do anything to gain his power. He does still have a conscience when it comes to considering killing Duncan and whether or not it's right, because he stops and he wants to back out of it. However, he does stop thinking for himself once Lady Macbeth questions his manhood and his courage. When we first see Lady Macbeth, it's quite obvious that she's in control of the relationship. She has opposing feelings than Macbeth about killing Duncan, and she never questions this. This is something she wants to do from the get-go. Lady Macbeth and Macbeth switch roles later on in the play, where Macbeth becomes the one who will kill for power, and Lady Macbeth begins questioning whether or not it's right. Some significant symbols and motifs. The symbol of blood. The play starts on a battlefield. In Act 1, Scene 2, what bloody man is this? When we have marked with blood those sleepy two of his own chambers and used their very daggers, we see this symbol that blood is seen throughout the play. Some different motifs, the prophecies. The witches give Macbeth and Banquo prophecies at the beginning of the play, and they will reappear with more. Violence. It's evident that violence will recur multiple times throughout this play with the killings and the battles. Some of the themes we see within this first act are the power controlling people's lives. In Act 1, we begin to see how gaining power starts to control Macbeth's life as well as Lady Macbeth's. Once the first prophecy comes true, they begin to believe that murder is the only way to get the throne and have power. We see some conflict with gender. Lady Macbeth begins to question the masculinity of her husband because he doesn't want to carry out a murder. And Lady Macbeth seems maybe not more masculine, but definitely like more of the leader in the relationship compared to Macbeth. So we're going to stop there for today. That's a pretty decent synopsis of Act 1. I do want you to keep reading and following the course lessons. Hopefully, we will be meeting back together soon. I can't wait to be back with you guys. But I did find another source that I think is really good. There's an entire playlist on coursehero.com for Macbeth. There are, I think, 14 videos in total, and there's a whole playlist of them that I've linked here. So if you're one that kind of likes, and I know Shakespeare is hard, so if you want to read the act and then kind of look at the Course Hero video to give you a synopsis of what you just read, these are really good videos. There's some videos about context, about characters, about theme, and as well as the brief little summaries for each act and scene. So these are excellent if you just want some extra help as you're reading. Here's the link listed right here on the PowerPoint. So that's all I've got for you today. Hopefully we will be back together soon, guys. Hope to see you soon. Have fun.